here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about really the historical basis for the growth in radicalisation and how both the UK and the Indian subcontinent have been rather sort of cross-fertilised by particular Islamist and Jihadist actors across several decades now. Now, you can always tell a lot about a speaker and their theoretical approach by the starting point that they take. And it always greatly frustrates me as an academic when I see lectures, talks, beginning with, for example, 9/11, as if 9/11 was when the world began or modern history began. Not so. So perhaps make some judgments about my approach by looking here at my slide, which, as you can see, focuses on Mrs. Thatcher's visit to Pakistan back in October 1981. And here she is with General Zia. And this was a visit which was seen very much on both the British and Pakistani sides as really an endorsement of Zia. And this was the era, of course, where Pakistan was going through a process of Islamification and where the struggle was really just beginning to gather momentum against the communist government in Kabul. And General Zia, very much a man who knew how to treat a lady. He took Mrs. Thatcher to Peshawar to visit a refugee camp. And there Mrs. Thatcher really was seen as endorsing not just the struggle of the refugees, talking about their conditions, but really going forward the Mujahideen themselves. And this is something which the rather problematic legacy this has left very much overlooked, certainly in the UK. Like lots of people in the UK saying how terrible it was Mrs. Thatcher was in bed with General Pinochet, dictatorship in Chile, human rights abuses. We don't, for whatever reason, tend to look as critically at the relationship with Zia, despite some of the long-term consequences. And really, those consequences, we begin to see them in the 1990s. And the impetus that the struggle in Afghanistan had given to Sunni armed insurgent groups continues with the Bosnian Mujahideen. And we know from some of the memoirs, some of the articles written by British Muslims in this period who got involved in such groups, that as well as Bosnia, the issue of Kashmir really sort of shines a beacon for them. Now, just to be clear, it's not just about Britons going out to the Indian subcontinent, going to other parts of the world, joining such groups, but about people from Pakistan in particular, clerics coming to the UK and recruiting. And so, 1993, we have a British-speaking tour by Masood Azhar, and this a tour which really gains support from leading Deobandi clerics and institutions in the UK. So something like 40 talks given during that visit, and he's talking very much about how young British Muslims should be seeking jihad. Consequences of this, in a way, become seen quite quickly. Omar Saeed Sheikh, who I'll come on to, involved in kidnappings in New Delhi, 1994. And then 1995, we have Hafiz Saeed, who's been all over the media in Pakistan, I believe, in the past 6 months or so. But we see his UK-speaking tour, which is a mixture of mosques, Islamic centres, but also UK universities. So Leicester University, one of the institutions that I teach at, he's speaking there, inviting students to travel to Kashmir, to travel to Bosnia, where they will find salvation. Now, politically, we have quite a significant change in the late 1990s in the UK with, obviously, new Labour government, Tony Blair, but the emergence of an attempt, really, to bring together representation for the hugely disparate British Muslim community under the control of the Muslim Council of Britain, which is very much a Jamaat Islami-dominated organisation. And a big part of their early political activity, the late 1990s, supporting armed struggle in Kashmir, lobbying against counter-terrorism policies, which could prescribe any of those organisations in the UK. And really an attempt by the MCB to sort of control the discourse around terrorism as well. And just to finish on this slide, obviously, the Taliban regime from 1996 onwards really offers a sort of beacon of actually existing Sharia, as it was seen by some of its young supporters. And Pakistan really provides the bridge from which those people enter Afghanistan. How did this sort of thing occur? Well, this is an email reproduced from the British media in 1999. Rail industry professional Mohammed Bilal, who was recruiting young Britons for Kashmir. And you can see here, training's being offered in Azad, Kashmir, with the LET, 21 days training, slightly shorter for students, and also you can go to Afghanistan if you want as well. It's a sort of one-stop shop for jihadists, if you like. Now, I think a lot of the importance of these developments was missed, and it was certainly missed up until 9/11. Then there's probably really the start of looking critically at some of the Britons going out to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, etc., etc. And, of course, when we start seeing such people being arrested following the collapse of the Taliban, again, some questions emerge. But historically, when we've talked about the emergence of British jihadism, the focus hasn't been so much on Hafiz Saeed or Masood Azhar, been much more about some of the Arab clerics, Abu Qatada, Abu Hamza, Omar Bakri Muhammad. And I think in recent years, people have begun to argue that may well be mistaken. And a couple of quotes you see on the screen there, but the second from Innes Bowen, the BBC's religious affairs correspondent, really encapsulates this argument. Okay, so some examples of the violence which we can trace to this sort of cross-fertilization of the UK and South Asia. Here are examples of Britons in the Indian subcontinent involved in suicide bombing, involved in attacks, involved in kidnappings. So we believe the first British suicide bomber was as far back as 1996. So just a pseudonym, obviously, there, Khalid Shaheed. But he was a young man from Birmingham who'd been involved in the Al-Maharoon group and joins up with the Taliban. Other examples with the Army of Muhammad group in Pakistan, and Omar Saeed Sheikh, you'll see pictured here. He's still, I believe, on death row in Pakistan, but involved in kidnappings in 1994. If you remember the Indian Airlines hostage crisis of 1999, the plane that was taken to Afghanistan, that was to get him and Masood Azhar freed from Indian custody. And I'm sometimes asked, how important are the Britons in these types of groups? I think the honest answer is usually not very. They're foot soldiers, they're keen participants. But a possible exception to that is Rashid Rauf, who marries into Masood Azhar's family. And you'll see him pictured here, almost certainly involved in the 7/7 bombings in London. Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, the leader of the 7/7 group, was receiving several phone calls a day from Rawalpindi in the run-up to the attacks. So who was on the other end of the phone? Never been established, but quite likely to have been Rauf. Rauf survives that period, isn't arrested, but is in the following the liquid bomb plot 2006, mysteriously escapes from custody and is then believed to have been killed in a drone attack. So on my slide here, some of the examples of major terrorist plots, terrorist attacks within the UK, whose origins can be traced back to the Indian subcontinent. Perhaps the least well-known, you'll see the Exeter restaurant bombing by Nicky Riley there. He was a white convert to Islam with learning difficulties and appears to have been befriended online by some Pakistanis after his conversion who gave him the instructions for constructing a device that was ultimately unsuccessful. So we reached a situation by the time of Gordon Brown's visit to Pakistan in 2008, 3/4 of the terrorist plots in the UK, the British government are alleging, are from Pakistan. Does this type of violence continue? Well, see a few additional points there on the interaction between Britons and some of the terrorist groups out there. But it's also worth stressing that in Afghanistan, as late as 2009, Britain was fighting Britain. So we have British Army intelligence picking up signals, picking up recordings of people with British accents in the Taliban, among the Taliban fighters. And, you know, they're trying sometimes not to speak in their native tongue, but they're slipping back and forth, if you like. Now, obviously, this nexus rather peters out post-2011, post-2012, with the jihad in Syria. And that's really been the destination of choice for most Britons in recent years, exception of a few guys going to Somalia, for example, or Libya. But a couple of examples to show this trend continues. A young man here from Dudley, you'll see on the screen, fought for 2 years in South Waziristan before heading on to Syria. Now, I work entirely from open source material, so I can only really give you, in terms of death tolls, figures that are in the public domain. So just looking here, I've been able to name 10 Britons killed fighting in Afghanistan from 1996 to 2011 in jihadist organisations, and slightly lower number, I think 9 in Pakistan and Indian-controlled Kashmir, majority of those in drone strikes. And this does also include people like Mohammed Abu Rida here, who was a Jordanian living in Britain, placed on a control order, and you can see it was a big campaign for him to be freed, his children utilised here, released from the control order, doesn't go to Jordan with his children, as his wife left Britain for Jordan, but instead goes to Pakistan, rejoins Al-Qaeda, and is killed in Afghanistan. The most recent British death is that of Dr. Mirza Ali, Pakistani who'd been based in Britain, medical doctor who'd been agitating in the group called Sharia for Pakistan against, for example, Malala Yousafzai, who seemed to have a particular obsession with condemning her, but he fled a court case in Britain and was killed fighting with the Taliban in 2015. Okay, picture that I've got up on the screen here is of a very short-lived group in the UK called Sharia for Pakistan. And if there's any Londoners here or anybody from London, you should recognise some of the guys here. This is basically Al Maharoon, Anjem Chowdhury's group. Obsession with developing different organisations, both in the UK and elsewhere. Some of these, Sharia for Belgium, for example, do seem to have preceded and attracted recruits. Sharia for Pakistan claimed they were going to have a big meeting at the Red Mosque in Islamabad. Never happened. And indeed, I think actually getting into the country for some of these guys, very, very difficult. Both Hizb ut-Tahrir and Al Maharoon, though, have attempted to send out cadre, to send out representatives to Pakistan to recruit. And so, you know, lots of my colleagues at SOAS like to talk about post-colonialism. I'm not sure if this particularly counts as an example of post-colonialism, but these groups have tended not to prosper, I think, because of security service interest at both ends of the equation, and particularly with a group like Hizb ut-Tahrir, whose theoretical political approach is to gain power via a military coup. So the Pakistani army isn't going to allow groups like that to prosper. Okay, thank you for your attention. Much of what I've said will be covered in my book, British Jihadism, The Detail and the Denial, which should hopefully appear later this year. If anybody wants my slides, do please email me at my SOAS address there. And then just a final, really, thank you and recognition of the work that EFSAS do, which I think is very important, and I hope more people can get involved in it. Thank you.